Colistin resistance has spread around the world, has been identified in 30 to 40 countries at this point, and has, including in the United States, where it's been recorded in at least a half dozen infections. And that really is, people microbiologists use terms like apocalyptic to talk about where we are with the arrival of colistin resistance and the dearth of new antibiotics to take care of drugs that have become so highly resistant.
And now I'm very pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Maryn McKenna is an award-winning independent journalist who specializes in public health, global health, and food policy. She is a senior fellow at the Schuster Institute for Investigative Journalism, and she teaches in the Grady College of Journalism and Mass Communication at the University of Georgia. She is one of the stars of the documentary Resistance, and her TED Talk, What Do We Do When Antibiotics Don't Work Anymore?, has been viewed 1.5 million times and translated into 32 languages. Her previous books include Beating Back the Devil, Superbug, and Plucked, and she writes for the New York Times Magazine, National Geographic, Wired, Scientific American, NPR, Nature, among others. She'll be joined in conversation this evening by Nicholas Evans, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at University of Massachusetts Lowell, whose research in bioethics is concerned with the ways we choose, fund, pursue, publish, and use scientific research. Tonight, they'll be discussing Maryn's latest book, Big Chicken. Mark Bittman calls it a page-turning story for anyone who cares about the quality of our food and the welfare of animals. Dan Fagan writes, "This enthralling book is ostensibly about chicken, but is really about us, the foolish choices we have made, and the happier, healthier future that awaits us all if we can liberate this most American food from the drug fix we have imposed on it." We are so pleased to host this event here at Harvard Bookstore tonight. Please join me in welcoming Maryn McKenna and Nicholas Evans.
Tell us the inspiration for Big Chicken, Maryn.
Okay. So, Big Chicken is the story of how we came to give antibiotics to almost all of the meat animals on the planet, and how we discovered that was a terrible idea, wrapped in the story of how we got the meat production system that we have and whether we can change it. And I got to this story, I just cannot sit like that, let's try this. I got to this story by writing about antibiotic resistance. I had been following the CDC's disease detectives around for a couple of years. I wrote a book about them. I got interested in the problem of antibiotic resistance and how it took us by surprise. And in the process of researching the rise of antibiotic resistance, I ran across a statistic that really knocked me back on my heels, which was that in the United States, in an average year, we sell 4 times as many antibiotics for use in animals as we do for use in people. Now, I had just exited the company of researchers and physicians and the victims of antibiotic resistance and the families of people who did not survive drug-resistant infections, all of whom were saying, antibiotics are precious. Antibiotics are a limited resource. Antibiotics are a thing that we need to protect and conserve. And how people could be saying that in the same time and place as a situation in which we were giving antibiotics so freely to animals, most of whom are not sick, that antibiotics were literally being sold over the counter by the pound or drum. I have a 2-pound bag of Oreomycin on my desk at home that I bought in order to prove this, that I needed to understand how that happened. And so those statistics were really the beginning of the 4-year journey that ended up in the text of this book.
Right, and so as you said, we don't use antibiotics in animals solely for curing of disease. Right? So of course, sometimes animals get sick, and as you describe in your book, sometimes the reasons they get sick sometimes the reasons they get sick are based on the ways that we treat them, not just, you or I getting sick because we get a bug. So what is the dominant use of antibiotics in modern agriculture, and how did that arise?
So you can think of the way we use antibiotics in animals as a spectrum. And at one end, there is actually treating animals that are sick, which is the way we use antibiotics in humans, is to cure infections. On the other end of that spectrum, there's this bizarre process identified in the late 1940s, early 1950s called growth promotion, which is giving tiny doses of antibiotics to animals far smaller than would cure an infection in a manner that we now know that this was not understood at the time, in a manner that disrupts the mix of bacteria in their gut microbiomes, such that it changes the way that they take up nutrition, the effect of which is they get fat faster. That's why they're called growth promoters. And in between, there's a sort of mushy middle category of called prevention or prophylaxis, sometimes metaphylaxis, which is protecting animals against diseases occurring. Sometimes those are diseases, often they're diseases of crowding or diseases caused by the conditions of barns and feedlots. For that middle category and that category at this end, none of that cures infections. So if we did any of that in humans, we would consider it inappropriate use.
Right. I come from a family of doctors, and I remember being yelled at by my family for not taking all my antibiotics when I was given a course. And so naturally, one would think that if you're giving animals just very tiny doses, that you're necessarily going to be using them inappropriately.
Right.
So what was the incentive to give them these tiny doses, and were people aware from the get-go that there were costs associated with this, or did that come later?
So the answer to the second question is no. They didn't know right away, and it's kind of interesting to me that that it didn't occur to anyone to think about it. So so I'll tell you how this came about, and then I'll tell you why it seems bizarre that their thinking was so limited. In order to understand how we got to the use of antibiotics in agriculture that we have now, you have to go back to the end of World War II, which happens to be also the beginning of the antibiotic era. And I think that, I'm looking around, everyone in this room would have been born within the antibiotic era, which begins in 1928, when Alexander Fleming leaves a window open in his laboratory in London, something blows onto his plates of bacteria, kills them, and he discovers that what has blown onto them is the mold penicillium. The compound that it makes is the first natural antibiotic, penicillin. From that is the start of the antibiotic era, though penicillin doesn't actually get developed into a drug and get rolled out until 1943 for a complicated set of reasons. So penicillin comes out on the battlefields of Europe in 1943, makes it into the general population in 1944, is an extraordinary sensation. People who would have died terrible, lingering deaths from infectious diseases are cured instead in days. That's not hypothetical. I actually have a relative who died of a drug-resistant infection in 1938, and I have the account of his illness and his death, and it was gruesome. So immediately after penicillin, we get all the other drugs that make up sort of the first generation of antibiotics, the tetracyclines and streptomycin and chloramphenicol, and they all, because of the way that penicillin is first introduced, penicillin itself, the compound, the original compound, is not a moneymaker, but it's not patented. But the ways in which companies process it for the war effort is patented. And all the subsequent drugs are patented and make tremendous amounts of money for their companies. And so those companies go looking for yet more uses of these new compounds. At the same time, at the end of World War II, when these drugs are coming out, there's a lot of fragility around the status of the food system because of damage to the food system during the war, that fields, arable land has been ruined by battles, crops and herds have been decimated, fishing fleets have been seized by navies, and the infrastructure of meat production has been built up in order to feed soldiers and sailors who now have all gone home. And so this sense of the food system's fragile and it's overextended and it needs a solution dovetails with these fascinating new compounds that people want to find a new market for. And all of that comes together in a laboratory outside New York City on Christmas Day, 1948, when a scientist named Thomas Jukes goes in to weigh chicks that he's been using in an experiment to trial the effect of different dietary supplements to add to the cheap feed that farmers now want to give their chickens in order to cut costs. He's given them cod liver oil and brewer's yeast and synthetic vitamins, and to one of the batches of chickens, he's given the dried, ground-up leftovers of manufacturing one of the drugs his companies make, which is the first tetracycline antibiotic, aureomycin. And the chicks that get aureomycin gain twice as much weight as any other chicks in the experiment. And from that, the whole infrastructure of giving antibiotics to animals grows up. Within 5 years, American farmers are giving animals, livestock, 500,000 pounds of antibiotics a year. And now it's almost 31 million pounds. That was a very long answer, I'm sorry.
That's okay, I'm a philosopher. It's actually a pretty short answer given where I'm from. And so these chickens grow, and so the title Big Chicken, for those of you who don't know, in the UK, I believe it's Plucked, is the title of the book. But here in the US, the title Big Chicken really does refer to a big chicken. Chickens actually change as a species, essentially.
That's right. The
under
modern meat chickens, broilers as they're called, now grow to twice the weight in half the time as they did in the 1950s when all of this got started. That's not solely as a result of antibiotics. It's also due to precision nutrition that comes along afterward, to selective crossbreeding, but it's antibiotics that start that process. And it also sort of is a reference to, the industry of chicken. And for people who, like me, are from Georgia, it's also a reference to a particular landmark outside the city of Atlanta, which is the Big Chicken, which is a KFC that was built in 1963 that is about 6 stories tall and has a beak that opens and closes and an eye that's a clock that goes round and round. And everyone gives directions by, not by like go now north or south or east or west from Marietta Square, but go to the Big Chicken. So it's a little private joke.
That's actually really exciting. So in Australia, we have an obsession with comically large things.
You must come see the Big Chicken.
Yeah, well, so one of the first things I showed my then fiancée, now wife, when we were driving around Australia was the big merino, which is just a giant statue of a sheep that doesn't exist for any other reason than to be a giant sheep.
Be big.
Yeah, no,
yes.
it's a thing in Australia, so I'll definitely go see the
Yes,
Big Chicken.
please come see the Big Chicken. So the part of your earlier question that I didn't answer is, did anyone think that this was a bad idea? And the answer, astonishingly, is no. There's a fair amount of research in the early 1950s just confirming that this effect exists. Within about 5 years, there's a couple of hundred scientific papers all written on interrogating this phenomenon of growth promotion. But no one seems to question whether antibiotic resistance is going to be the result, except in as much as they think that if bacteria in the animal systems become resistant because they're being exposed to antibiotics, then this phenomenon of growth promotion is just going to stop working. The antibiotics won't confer this effect anymore. The reason that I find this extraordinary is that 3 years before Jukes' experiment, in 1945, Alexander Fleming, the guy who left his window open in London and discovered natural penicillin as a result, received the Nobel Prize in Medicine along with his collaborators for developing penicillin. And in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he warned that if we accidentally underdosed with antibiotics, what would result is antibiotic-resistant infections in people. And though this was 3 years in advance of the experiment, what he was describing as potentially happening in humans is exactly what the scientist Thomas Jukes would do in animals, is deliberate underdosing. So the flaw in the thinking back in the 50s was they assumed that if bacteria in the animal systems, in their guts, became resistant, any effect of that would stop with the animal. It never seems to have occurred to them to think, these are in the animal's guts. The gut contents of the animal leave the animals all the time as manure, or when the animals are disassembled at slaughter. And thus those resistant bacteria that are present in the guts move on, into the environment or onto the meat that the animals become. It took about another 10 years or so after Jukes' experiment to begin to demonstrate that there really was a human health threat as a result of this flagrant antibiotic use.
And in that 10-year period, the chicken, as I understand it from your book, the chicken industry undergoes a transformation. Not just the chickens themselves, but the way we actually manufacture chickens from things that run around on the ground and eat seeds and squawk to the things that we eat on our table.
So another reason why this book is called Big Chicken is that the story of chicken sort of brackets the story of antibiotic use in agriculture. And for me, looking at this antibiotic use was kind of opening a door into how we got the meat animals and the system that we produce them that we now have. Chicken turns out to be sort of a nexus of an extraordinary number of innovations that viewed on their own are positive, though they almost all have unintended consequences. But before growth promoters, there's the invention of the electric incubator, which allows farmers to keep hens producing because hens no longer have to spend a certain number of months in their limited lives actually brooding on eggs. There are systems for sexing eggs. There are growth promoters. And where am I going with this? So that after growth promoters, there's this, we suddenly have the ability to produce chickens and subsequently other meat animals more rapidly, or to produce them in the same amount of time on less feed. But we don't yet have so we can supply more chicken. And the next innovation that's necessary is to cause people to demand more chicken. And there's another sort of rolling series of innovations that turns chickens from scrawny backyard birds or barnyard birds into the big meaty chickens that are familiar to us today. There's actually a contest across the United States to change the shape of chicken. It's called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest, in which it's co-sponsored by the USDA and the A&P supermarkets, and they express that what they want is chickens that are so meaty that they have breasts that can be sliced like a steak, which expresses not only the deliciousness of what they want, but also, if you think about sort of the contrapositive, what the chickens of the time must have been like, that they were not sliceable in that manner. And from the winners of that contest, we get those chickens that are sort of win that contest are the literal parent birds of most of the commercial varieties we have today. So chickens get bigger and fatter, and because they are bigger and fatter, they become more docile. Therefore, it's easier to confine them in sheds, the football-sized sheds that are used today. Nutrition gets adjusted, so chickens no longer need to peck and hunt. They get all their nutrition from concocted feed. It still doesn't solve the problem of whether people want to eat more chicken. And the final innovation that I think is just fascinating is the innovation that takes chicken from an animal that is part of that takes chicken from a carcass, from a thing that is a concoction of muscle and bone, to the chicken that is the chicken that most of us eat today, which is the invention of the chicken nugget, which takes chicken from a thing that takes a while to cook and only feeds a couple of people at a time. And is a little complicated to handle in a home kitchen, to a thing that you can buy in a drive-through and eat one-handed while you're driving a car. And the person who's actually responsible for this is not actually McDonald's, or not the chefs at McDonald's, but a little-known Cornell University professor who, in his basement laboratory in 1963, came up with a thing he called the chicken stick, and sent out the recipe in Cornell's agricultural extension bulletins, where it probably passed into the archives of McDonald's and then was reconcocted by them 17 years later.
Yeah, the chicken stick, but unlike the fish stick, it had to be made into something quite a bit grosser than just cutting a piece of fish off.
Right. So chicken, the fish stick was probably the innovation, because the fish stick did for fish what the chicken stick, later nugget, did for chicken, which was made that protein available to people in an uncomplicated manner. But if you think of the size of fish, the kind of fish that fish sticks are made out of, they're sliced out of planks, out of fillets, out of sides of fish. Chicken sticks, McNuggets, were made out of comminuted muscle, out of muscle that was ground up and stuck back together with extracted protein. So they don't have, that's why a nugget even now doesn't have the texture of of whole muscle, except for a couple of the fast food chains, in the way that a fish stick has the texture of whole muscle if you break it open.
Yeah. And so we get the fish stick, and industrial chicken suddenly kind of takes off because we've got the supply, we've got the demand, and everyone's happy for a while, except the
For a while.
chickens who are very unhappy. And then chicken becomes dangerous, as you say in part 2 of your book. How does chicken become dangerous?
So it's really interesting to me that, as I said, that no one really thought about, or at least articulated publicly, that there might be some unintended consequences to this feeding of antibiotics to animals. And the first sort of indication that something is going wrong actually doesn't happen in chicken. It happens in the dairy industry. In the early 1960s, children drink more milk than adults, and children start developing penicillin allergies, even if they've never actually received the drug, because dairy farmers are dosing their cows with so much penicillin to take care of mastitis that there's active penicillin left in the milk. And then cheesemakers start complaining that they can't make cheese anymore because there's so much penicillin in the milk that it kills the beneficial bacteria that they use. But in England, and I'm going to hypothesize this shows up first in England because it's just a smaller place. I grew up in England, and even when I was a kid, the towns and villages, let alone cities, and agriculture were just more interpenetrated. I mean, there were cows and sheep right outside the fields of my school, game fields. Unlike here in the United States, where most livestock production is kind of sequestered away from urban centers. So in England, physicians and epidemiologists start to notice that there are suddenly outbreaks of drug-resistant foodborne illness, which is not a thing that has ever existed in the world before. And some of these outbreaks are really devastating. Hundreds of people ill. In one really notable outbreak in a town in Yorkshire, 14 of the small town's children are killed by a drug-resistant strain of E. coli that has traveled into the town on meat. And that is such a shock that the UK becomes the first government to consider and then pass government-level regulation on the restriction of antibiotic use in agriculture as a way of reversing the forward march of outbreaks like that.
And so from England, we move over to the US, and everyone here, I imagine, has been listening to conversations about regulation recently for a range of topics, and the story probably isn't going to surprise them as we move into the US.
So an interesting thing, it's really fun to talk about this story in Boston because it's in Boston where the connection between antibiotic use in farm animals and the deleterious effect on human health really gets proven by a gentleman who was in the 1970s and is still on the faculty at Tufts, Stuart Levey, who in 1976 set up what was effectively an experimental farm on a family property in Sherburne, down in the southwest of Boston. And he finds a family with a lot of foster kids that are living on a property that used to be an egg sorting business and that has a lot of barns and sheds. And he asks them to run an experiment for him. And he brings them a set of newborn chicks. And they build a bunch of pens, and they lock the chicks in the different pens. And then he goes to the feed store, and he buys antibiotic-free feed, and very standard for laying hens, feed enhanced with antibiotics. And he asks them to feed the feed to the antibiotic-laced feed to certain pens, and the antibiotic-free feed to other pens. And then over months, he demonstrates that resistant bacteria arise in the chickens, first in the chickens that got the antibiotic-laced feed, but then in the chickens that got the antibiotic-free feed, even though they've had no contact with the other chickens, and finally in the systems of the farm family themselves. So in this lovely prospective experiment that actually has never really been duplicated, he demonstrates that resistant bacteria not only arise in animals receiving antibiotics, but that those resistant bacteria travel through the farm environment and end up in people, even if those people have not had, some of the members of the family had no contact with the chickens at all. And because of that, in 1977, the brand new Carter administration says, they come to Washington vowing to change it as reformist administrations always do, and they say one of the things they're going to do is they're going to change this use of antibiotics in agriculture. They propose to take back the licenses that the FDA gave in the 1950s to approve the sale of antibiotics for feeding to farm animals, and they announced that they're going to have a hearing, and they're going to summon the manufacturers to testify at the hearing, the drug manufacturers. And agricultural interests in Congress tell them that no, they're not. They send a message to the White House that if this hearing goes forward, they, the congressmen, will hold the FDA's entire budget hostage. And so the Carter White House communicates to their new FDA commissioner that maybe this hearing was not such a good idea after all. And so the hearing goes away, and the possibility for antibiotic control, as happened in the UK, goes away. And the US enters effectively a stalemate between regulation and manufacture that only ended last year in January 2017.
It's amazing. It's amazing. Big scare quotes. So this goes on for as you say, decades, right? So this starts in the Carter administration and goes on through to almost present day. And meanwhile, the chickens continue to get sicker and sicker, effectively, because we get more antibiotics, we get more kinds of antibiotics, and we keep on giving more and more antibiotics. And there seems to be this turning point, actually fairly recently, around a very little-known antibiotic all the way over in China.
Right.
And this is kind of where the rubber really starts to hit the road on this issue of antibiotics.
So I think, if someone were paying attention, but for the most part people didn't, because this is a big country, and most outbreaks, unless they get very, very large, are usually just only a matter of sort of local news, not national news. But from the 1980s and in the 1990s and in the 2000s, there were repeated outbreaks, sometimes very large, of both drug-resistant foodborne illness and other drug-resistant infections associated with the transit of drug-resistant bacteria on meat. Everything from Salmonella and E. coli to links to urinary tract infections and kidney infections. In just one example of something that's very common, in 2014, the CDC analyzed an outbreak of drug-resistant salmonella emanating from just one plant in California, a chicken slaughter plant, that made the known victims of which were 638 people in 29 states and Puerto Rico. But there were probably several thousand, because the CDC estimates that for every victim of foodborne illness that you find, there's probably at least 30, maybe 40 who were never diagnosed and identified. But all of that was kind of just sort of background noise. What was going on at the same time, though, is that as drug resistance advanced, not just as a result of agriculture, but as a result of medical misbehavior around antibiotics as well, pharma companies began to back away from making antibiotics, because antibiotics lose their power so rapidly as a result of resistance that they aren't really very good investments for manufacturers. And so in this sort of endless game of leapfrog between bugs and drugs, the bugs kept moving ahead and the available drugs kept falling behind, until we got to effectively just a couple of last resort antibiotics. And the most last resort of them all at the moment is a drug called colistin, which actually dates back to, it was licensed in 1955. And the reason it still works is that it's such a toxic drug. It's very destructive to the kidneys, that medicine kind of put it on the shelf for decades and said, we hope we'll never have to use this, but we'll keep it until we did. And then in the 2000s, they started to realize that they needed it. Well, in those decades, agriculture got hold of colistin, which was a reasonable thing to do because medicine had indicated that it wasn't very interested in using this drug. And colistin became very important, not as a growth promoter, but for preventive use, particularly in pigs and in young cattle. So in 2013, a British researcher from the University of Cardiff named Timothy Walsh, who's been very, very important in elucidating the movement of really toxic, highly resistant organisms around the globe, happened to be in China, working on setting up additional lab capacity for identifying resistance as a guest of the Chinese government. And one of his collaborators was driving him to the airport, and he looked a little fidgety, and he said, "Tim, I have something to tell you. We've been working with these new tools you taught us, and we found a thing." Walsh said, "Really, what is that?" And his researchers said, "We found colistin resistance," which people had thought would never happen because of the particular molecular mechanisms that it takes to make durable resistance to colistin. But what they'd found was not just resistance to colistin, but resistance on a piece of DNA that can move freely among bacteria. That one finding led to the discovery of what is effectively a worldwide epidemic of colistin resistance as a result of thousands of tons of antibiotic, of this drug, being used in agriculture, not so much in the United States, actually, but in China and in Europe. And now colistin resistance has spread around the world, has been identified in 30 to 40 countries at this point, and has, including in the United States, where it's been recorded in at least a half dozen infections. And that really is, people microbiologists use terms like apocalyptic to talk about where we are with the arrival of colistin resistance and the dearth of new antibiotics to take care of drugs that have become so highly resistant.
Yeah, this antimicrobial resistance even attracted, as I understand it, the UN General Assembly's attention, which is very rare for a health issue. Normally it's reserved only for things like the Ebola outbreak.
Right, or HIV,
yeah.
right. The General Assembly has only taken up in all of its life 3 or maybe 4 health topics. And in 2016, antimicrobial resistance was one of them. And they held a day-long meeting at which the then Secretary General called antibiotic resistance the gravest and most urgent global risk, which is not the kind of language you hear from international politicians every day.
Yeah, in the philosophy literature, we don't use apocalypse anymore. We have catastrophic risk instead.
Oh, nice, I like that.
And the next step up is existential risk, because we have fancy terms for really bad things.
I think I'm going to put catastrophe in my next book title.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
good, I like that.
Catastrophic risk. It's really nice. But it's not just individual birds that are being fed these drugs and then resistance develops there. These bugs are on the move,
Right.
and not just the physical bugs, but their genes are on the move.
Right. So the recognition that started with Stuart Levey that resistant bacteria were not only being transported on meat, but that could move freely through the environment, has been examined by successive researchers, and it's been demonstrated that resistant bacteria can leave farm properties in groundwater and surface water, dust on the wind, on the feet of insects and rodents, on the skin and in the clothing of farm workers. You can be at risk of acquiring a drug-resistant infection if you even live near a large farm, even if you have no contact with that farm or its animals or its personnel. And the problem is not only, as you say, that it's not just that resistant bacteria themselves are transiting through the environment, but that even if those bacteria expire, that the resistance DNA that they contained can be picked up by other bacteria. So this is effective. We have no surveillance system for tracking this. We have no way of, we have not made the investment to show the dissemination of resistance. We kind of wait for people to get sick, and then we try to do something about it.
Right. And this is one of the things that fascinates me so much about antimicrobial resistance, insofar as you can be fascinated by terrifying things.
By existential dread.
By existential dread, which many philosophers have been fascinated by over the years, is that this is not just a single threat, this is a double threat in some ways, because we could all die of antimicrobial resistant bacteria. That's one apocalyptic scenario. But the other problem is that the world population is growing so fast, and people are increasingly acknowledging that we're running out of food. And we have a meat system that is under load and under strain from all of these antimicrobial resistant bacteria. So what's going to break first for us, right? Are we going to run out of food, or are we going to run out of drugs first?
We're already running out of drugs. So this is the point at which this story gets most dire, but also at the same time I think shows some hope. I promise there is actually a bit of a happy ending here, although it's kind of a fragile happy ending. I don't want you all to go away being deeply depressed. So one of the most reliable signals for an economist that an economy is improving is that meat sales go up. Because as people enter the middle class, we are so hardwired to want to eat meat that as soon as people get some extra income, they spend it on meat. And the curves of spending for the developing economies, for China, for India, for Brazil, for places like that, on meat are rising at an incredible rate. Where is that meat coming from? There is no place in the world that has an infinite amount of arable land on which to raise animals. So where that meat is coming from is from the kind of industrial systems that we created here in the United States and then taught to the rest of the world. That's not good. The part of this that's potentially encouraging is that lagging this phenomenon of the industrialized meat system is the beginnings of an understanding that using antibiotics in this manner really was a mistake. So there was regulation in Western Europe in 2006 that took out growth promoters. That's partial regulation, not complete, but it was a huge step. We got new regulations as one of the last acts of the Obama administration in January 2017. And in China, as a result of the shock of that discovery of that highly resistant organism emerging from it turned out from Chinese agriculture. It was found by those researchers simultaneously in people, in pigs, and in retail meat in markets. The central government of China actually banned colistin from use in its agriculture, taking something like 8,000 tons of the drug off the market and not making it available to their farmers. The thing is, antibiotic use in agriculture is a problem a lot like climate change. For a couple of different reasons. The first is that it feels like such an overwhelming threat, and anything that any of us can do in response to it feels so small. Like if you or I buy a package of antibiotic-free pork chops, can we actually believe we're making a difference? It's like buying the right kind of light bulb while you think about the polar bears drowning. But it's also like climate change in that the industrialized world and the global south are in different places. And so, for climate change, we in the industrialized West have been saying to the global South, listen, we had those Chevys, we had those big fancy refrigerators, we had an emissions problem. Could you skip those? Would you mind? Because the world's really in trouble. And now we are saying to them, look, we had our juicy steaks and our big fat chickens, and that was a mistake too, and could you please just kind of skip that step in your social evolution? And the global South is very reasonably saying, no, we want our juicy steaks as well. So how, as the West showed the global South how to raise meat in this manner, can we also help them understand that the supports for that system of raising meat are endangering the world in ways that are not necessarily immediately obvious. For a good part of the global South, the lack of availability of antibiotics is a bigger problem than the misuse of antibiotics. The thing that gives me hope, the hopeful moment in this is not only things like the Chinese central government saying you can't have that drug anymore, farmers. It's that companies themselves have started to change in advance of regulation. In 2014, the chicken company Purdue, which some people in the room may remember used to be represented by Frank Purdue, the son of the founder, who had about 20 years of TV commercials saying it takes a tough man to make a tender chicken. He actually kind of looked like a chicken. So Purdue is now run by Frank's son, Jim. And in 2014, Jim Purdue summoned a press conference in Washington, D.C., and stood up at this press conference kind of out of nowhere and said, we have a message to convey. We're not using antibiotics anymore. In fact, we haven't for about 10 years. Now, Purdue is the 4th largest chicken company in America. And they did that entirely on their own. And they shocked the rest of their industry to the point where Cargill and Tyson and Smithfield and Foster Farms and almost every chicken company in America, with one exception, followed behind them. And the reason I believe that they did this, in fact, this is what they've told me, is that they felt such pressure from consumers to change the way that they produced meat. That there was such a coalition of moms and chefs and people who buy meat for school lunch programs and for hospitals and so forth, that companies were beginning to feel hurt on their bottom line and beginning to feel that they had a market waiting for them if they changed. And so that companies can change. This happened 2 years before the Obama administration regulations changed. That companies feel like they can change their practices and that they can feel pressured by consumers enough to change their practices gives me hope that we may be on an upward trajectory out of what has otherwise been a pretty frightening story about unintended consequences and mistakes we made without knowing we were making them.
Which, as we start to wrap up so people can ask their questions, leads to how the chicken is changing and changing back. And as a pro tip to readers, don't read the prologue of this book when you're hungry, and don't read the second act of this book when you're full, because that's the gross bit in the middle. French chickens. Glorious, juicy French chickens, which, as I understand, this practice, the Rouge Farm chickens, which are a particular kind of chicken in France, near the Spanish border, were made antibiotic-free, but were also made in a very sustainable capacity prior, as I understand it, to the EU regulations. This has been a long practice for them. And this is kind of indicative, in addition to an example you give in the Netherlands, of the ways that chicken can change, and change for not just the good of people and, not dying of antimicrobial resistance, but also good for the chicken, so that their lives can be good right up until the point that we kill and eat them.
So there are a couple of chapters in the book that talk about different models. There's sort of narratives of different models of farms around the world. One of which is a chapter set in France with these particular a variety of chicken that's raised on very small numbers on very small farms. That are they're a very distinctive breed of chicken. We would consider them very much a luxury chicken in America, but they are the standard Sunday lunch for families throughout France. They're really a sort of protected part of French culture. And they are raised, as Nick says, not only in an antibiotic-free manner, but in a very historic manner. That's a very low-tech and expensive way of raising chicken. The Netherlands is the #1 meat exporter in Europe, despite being a country about the size of this table. And they raise animals in an extremely high-tech and high-throughput manner, and they also have managed to go antibiotic-free. I think that both of those sort of present potential models to the world, but the thing that's most intriguing to me about them is that both of those systems, whether they're very high-tech or very low-tech, allow in some manner for animals to sort of express their natural behaviors, to exercise, to eat diets that are more pure than most of the diets that we give to meat animals in this country, to get natural light, to have a bit of room to roam, to have some sort of society with other animals. These are things that even big companies like Purdue are trialing now. The magic thing about those practices is that they're not only things that make the animals safer in the sense of not producing drug-resistant bacteria, they're also things that return flavor to them, because exercising and eating a better diet and allowing animals to choose the things they eat and getting sunlight and getting to roam around and getting to be less stressed are things that put flavor back in the flesh that we took out of animals when we industrialized them. And so it gives me hope that we are beginning to have a model for how to raise animals across a range from small pastured farms such as exist around here, the very expensive chickens that you could buy in some bespoke butchers, to even big industrialized farms that will be able to produce animals that are safer for people to eat, that have lives that are better for the animals to experience, and that I think ultimately will produce a better system that is better for farmers, better for eaters, and better for the animals themselves.
Sounds great. So we buy tastier, healthier, happier chickens. And pigs and everything else.
And pigs and cattle are the next big challenge, because chickens in some way were easy, because chickens are small and they don't live very long. They uniquely lent themselves to industrialization, and so the next challenge, the next chapter in this story, for someone else to write, because I'm not writing a book called Big Pig, is to figure out what happens for the more complicated animals, and whether we can take this evolution of making animal production better into pigs and into cattle, even into things like salmon aquaculture, which in certain countries uses huge amounts of antibiotics and is becoming a real flashpoint for some of the economies where that's practiced as a result.
All right, before we take some questions, would you please join me in thanking Maryn for coming out today and giving us these wonderful insights?
Thank you for your question.
If I misunderstood something, so is the resistance developed to a class of antibiotics, or is it that the industry, various industries, just use all the antibiotics in the processing of the food? I mean, I'm just trying to figure out how it is that all of these drugs have become perhaps suspect or useful.
Right, so that's a really good question, thank you. So at various times, multiple different antibiotics have been used in agriculture and of course in medicine as well. The particular mutations that confer resistance against certain classes of drugs protect against certain classes of drugs, but those mutations can stack up in bacteria so that you get bacteria that are multidrug resistant. And even if a bacterium is no longer exposed to, say, the first drug that it developed resistance to, depending on the durability of that mutation, it may hold on to that resistance even if it's not being exposed to the drug anymore.
How much cost? I mean, like in Europe or Tyson, how much more expensive was the chicken?
So it depends on the raising conditions of the chicken. So, for instance, one of the farms I talk about late in the book is what we would call a pasture-based farm here in the United States. It's a place called White Oak Pastures. It's in southwest Georgia. That is a fully organic, sort of post-organic pasture-based farm that raises 10 species, 5 with 4 feet, 5 with 2 feet. And their beef is about 30% more expensive than supermarket beef. And their chicken is about 300% more expensive, because pasture-based chickens are very intensive, very labor-intensive to raise. So that's sort of the American equivalent of what those French market chickens would be. That's one end of a spectrum. Purdue, on the other hand, says that they have reduced the stocking density of their birds, changed their diets, taken antibiotics out of the mix. They're giving them herbal supplements instead. They're cutting windows in the walls of their barns. They say that it has not affected their bottom line at all, that they're charging the same amount for the chicken and they're compensating their farmers the same amount. And that, I assume, is, for one thing, their birds are not pastured. They're not out on grass, so they're not having to be moved around to different pastures, or the coops aren't being dragged around. So there's much less labor going into it. I think that's also an expression of scale. So those are also antibiotic-free birds. They are not of the quality of, a French market chicken or a pasture-based chicken. That's not necessarily a bad thing, because pasture-based chickens, like these French chickens, they really taste different, because a bird that's been running around outside, flapping up into trees, eating insects, it may have a very rich, developed flavor because of what it's been doing, but it's also kind of chewy. I mean, those are in some ways the birds that our grandparents wanted to get away from when they started buying chickens that were the result of industrialization. If you look back in cookbooks from our grandparents' time, most of the recipes for chicken involve low, slow heat, because most of the chickens were actually hens that were at the end of their useful life of chasing chicks around barnyards. And so they had a very developed flavor from using their muscles a lot. They were kind of scrawny and tough. And a pasture-based bird can be scrawny and tough if you don't cook it carefully. More chickens that are raised in a more confined manner, that exercise less, even if they exercise some, generally have sort of softer, let's say, more tender flesh. A French farmer that I met, I describe him in the book, was trying to tell me the difference between French chickens and American chickens. And he thought we were speaking in a mix of French and English. And eventually he flipped back to French and he said, "We think your chickens are soft."
You said one of the big five didn't change. Can you disclose?
So yeah. So there's it's more than five, but there are, I'm not exactly sure how many off the top of my head, how many big chicken companies there are in the country, but there has been one really significant holdout, which is a company whose chickens are mostly sold in the South. I believe they're based in Texas and they're called Sanderson Farms. Sanderson Farms is so opposed to going antibiotic free that they've been running commercials, which you can find on YouTube, which they have two kind of country guy characters addressing the consumer and saying that going antibiotic free is a gimmick. There's a whole series of these commercials. They're really something, and they're, what they're expressing actually is it's a really disingenuous argument. They're saying that the reason it's a gimmick is that all chicken at sale is antibiotic free, and that's true if what you're talking about is antibiotic residue in the flesh, because that's federally regulated. But the point has never been residue. The point has been the generation of resistant bacteria as the animals are growing. And the companies that have gone antibiotic free are protecting us from that. And Sanderson Farms effectively is saying they don't think their consumers deserve to be protected from that.
How believable are labels then? I mean, organic, that process is from beginning to end, but like an antibiotic free, how believable?
So if it says raised without antibiotics or no antibiotics ever, those are label claims that are regulated. They are verified by the USDA. In a process that's actually called process verified. The problem is that the audit, it may only be done once. So it's possible that a company could, go out with antibiotic-free raising and then back off again. There is never a sufficient amount of auditing done. An interesting thing about organic is that in the United States, the organic standard for chicken starts on day 2 of the chicken's life, not at day 0. Which is it's different for pigs and for cattle, and that is to protect against excess mortality, against chicks being subject to insults and dying as they are being transported to an organic farm. So if you buy a chicken that's organic and it says antibiotic, unless it says no antibiotics ever, the chicken that, when it was a chick, that may have received antibiotics injected into the shell or on day 1 of its life. Now, the chances that actually generated durable resistant bacteria in the bird's system is probably pretty low, but it's not 0.
Is there any indication that we could regain the efficacy of some of the antibiotics by taking them out of circulation, out of use for a while? And how long would it, is there any data on how long it would take?
So thank you for that question. It's a very sophisticated question. He actually is a rocket scientist. The countries that have the longest experience with restricting antibiotics the most in agriculture are the Scandinavian countries and the Netherlands, both the longest and the toughest antibiotic restriction. They also happen to be single-payer health systems that have really good surveillance systems for both human health and animal health. And in Scandinavia and the Netherlands, you can see that when certain drugs are withdrawn from circulation, the resistance in the common bacteria does start to trend down after a couple of years. It's not necessarily a predictable effect, because since the mutations that protect against the action of different antibiotics are different, some of those mutations are more or less costly to bacteria. If they're not very costly, if it's not hard for the bacteria to hang on to them, if there's no metabolic cost, for instance, there's no reason for them to let it go, and so the mutation might be durable. But generally speaking, for most of, for instance, there's a drug that was banned from U.S. agriculture, one of the lone bright spots in this long story, back in 2005, and you can still find resistance to that drug in bacteria found on meat, because apparently that was not a costly mutation to hang on to. But generally speaking, in the data from the Netherlands, for the sort of pathogens of concern, resistance starts to go down, and then a couple of years later, it starts to go down in the human specimens as well, which is really exciting.
I direct a large undergraduate program in global health, and I know
Thank you for coming. That's awesome.
I'm very happy to be here. But I know you've been writing about antibiotic usage and unintended consequences for
A shockingly
decade
long
now.
time, yes.
And what do you think the most essential message for students that are going to go on to become public health professionals or physicians should have about antibiotics today?
Oh boy, that's a hard question, because there's so many. How do I distill it down? I think the most important question is, or the most important point to make, is that these really are not separate realms. So there's this emerging concept, which I'm sure is very familiar to you, called One Health, which says that we kind of made a mistake by siloing human health and animal health and environmental health into different academic specialties, and the problems that we should be most concerned about are ones that are sort of that cross across all of those silos. So just as misbehavior with antibiotics in animals shows up as a human health problem, pharmaceutical effluent, has an effect on human health as well. I would like people to start, who are just entering this field, to start thinking that the problems are horizontal, and that the solutions have to be ones that take multiple realms, multiple facets of the problem into account. The other thing I would like to think about is that I think the story of the change in chicken and the change in antibiotic regulation in the United States proves that individual consumers really have power. And this is kind of unique to the United States. Europe got antibiotic regulation in agriculture in 2006. So they never had the kind of consumer movement that we grew up organically here, because we didn't have regulation. People like the University of California system saying to their wholesalers, we're not going to spend our catering dollars on meat raised with routine antibiotic use anymore. And following the University of California, the Chicago Public Schools did the same thing. Now the city of New York is considering doing a similar thing for all the meat it buys across all of New York City, not just the school system, but for all the feeding that New York does, and things like its prison system, and its all the multiple things that cities do to feed people. So, but those movements were started by the critical mass of people going to the customer service desk at their supermarket and saying, explain to me what this label says, because I want I want meat that has a label that says something different. Enough people did that it had that sort of like butterfly wings creating a hurricane on the other side of the world stochastic effect of really creating change.
Hi, I am a little bit confused about the Levey experiment.
Yeah.
Where the chickens that were not fed the antibiotic feed also developed antibiotic-resistant
Correct.
bacteria. And was that proximity, or is that, what does that say about trying to silo off a realm of non-antibiotic?
What it expressed was that the bacteria that arose in the animals that were fed antibiotics traveled through the environment of the barn to the chickens, and then traveled through the environment of the farm to the family as well. The family, this is described in the book, he took poop samples from the family every week for months to see if they were developing resistant bacteria as well.
Traveling through the environment of the trucks, through the environment of the supermarket, and still jumping.
Right, which is why we need as much antibiotic control as we can get. My ultimate ask of agriculture would be that we use antibiotics only for animals that are sick, and not for growth promotion and not for preventive use. Because every time we use an antibiotic, we encourage bacteria to develop resistance to those antibiotics. When we use antibiotics to cure infections, there's a benefit that we can balance against the risk of developing resistance. But when we use an antibiotic when no infection is present, then that equation flips over entirely toward risk. And I don't think that's a risk we should take.